The judge smirked. The prosecution laughed. A black teen stood in court, accused of a crime she didn't commit. They thought it was an easy case, until she spoke. The room fell silent. What she revealed next shattered their bias and turned the entire trial on its head. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the air thick with tension. On one side, rows of white spectators whispered amongst themselves, their gazes sharp with doubt, some sneering in amusement, as if this trial was nothing more than a joke. On the other side, black onlookers sat stiff-backed, watching closely, hoping, praying, that justice for once would be served. At the center of it all stood Nia Thompson, a 17-year-old black girl, her sneakers lightly squeaking against the polished courtroom floor as she shifted her stance. Despite the suffocating atmosphere of hostility, she remained unnervingly calm. No fidgeting hands, no darting eyes, no visible fear. The accusation? Fraud and impersonation. The reason? Nia had dared to file a legal case against a wealthy white businessman, exposing how he illegally evicted black families from their homes in a gentrified district. But instead of investigating the landlord, the system turned on her, branding her a liar, a manipulator, a criminal. The judge, a towering figure draped in a black robe, leaned back in his chair with a slow, deliberate smirk. Judge Harold Brenner, an old-school white man with a reputation for disproportionately sentencing black defendants, rested his chin on his palm, eyes glinting with amusement. "Well, well," he drawled, tapping a pen against his desk. "Miss Thompson, do you even understand the charges brought against you?" A few chuckles rippled through the gallery, mostly from white onlookers who saw her presence in court as a spectacle rather than a serious case. Nia didn't flinch. Her shoulders remained squared, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Judge Brenner raised an eyebrow, the smirk deepening. "You sure about that? Because this isn't some high school debate club, young lady. This is a court of law." More laughter. The prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, a slick-haired, overly confident white attorney, didn't even bother hiding his amusement. He shook his head slightly, flipping through the case file as if it were already over. "This case is an insult to the court's time," Caldwell finally said, standing up, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defendant," he stressed the word with disdain, "was found with falsified documents attempting to deceive this court into believing she had the legal authority to sue my client." Nia remained quiet, her face unreadable. The judge sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Honestly, I don't even know why they let you represent yourself. This isn't some movie where you outsmart the system, Miss Thompson. You're a kid, a confused, misguided kid." The laughter from the white spectators grew louder. Even some of the jurors chuckled under their breath. But Nia still didn't react. She let the moment breathe, let the room drown in its own arrogance, because she knew something they didn't, and soon so would they. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, an undercurrent of amusement rippling through the mostly white spectators. They whispered to one another, smirking as they exchanged glances, already convinced of the outcome before the trial had even begun. On the other side of the room, black onlookers sat tensely, their faces solemn, eyes locked on the young girl standing at the defendant's table. Judge Harold Brenner leaned back in his chair, his robe hanging loosely over his broad frame, as he looked down at the 17-year-old black teenager standing before him. His lips curled into a smirk, eyes gleaming with disdain. "Miss Thompson," he drawled, pausing deliberately, "do you even understand what these charges mean, young lady?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, adjusted his cuffs and shook his head, chuckling under his breath as he rose from his seat. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he paced in front of the jury, his confidence dripping from every step. He turned to face them, flashing an easy, rehearsed smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, clasping his hands behind his back, "this case is as simple as it gets. The defendant," he gestured toward Nia like she was an object on display, "fraudulently posed as an attorney, tampered with legal documents, and attempted to deceive this honorable court." A few jurors nodded in agreement. The spectators murmured. More chuckles followed. Nia stood still, her expression unreadable. She had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in a world that constantly dismissed her, constantly assumed her ignorance. She wasn't rattled, not by the judge, not by the prosecutor, and certainly not by the snickering crowd. Caldwell paced toward the judge, shaking his head. "She's 17, Your Honor. A child. This is reckless behavior, not a real legal argument." The judge nodded, smirking as he tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. "I have to agree, Mr. Caldwell. This isn't a high school project, Miss Thompson. You don't just read a few books and decide you can practice law." The laughter grew louder, filling the courtroom with mocking amusement. Nia waited. She let the moment stretch, let them bask in their confidence. Then, without changing her tone, she said, "Objection, Your Honor." The room erupted again, louder this time. Ethan Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, this is rich," he said, turning to the judge. "Do you even know what an objection is, sweetheart?" A few gasps mixed with the laughter. Even some of the white spectators recognized the blatant condescension in his words. Nia met Caldwell's gaze with unwavering steadiness. "Yes, and that was a leading statement, which I'm sure you know is improper in court." The laughter died instantly. Caldwell stiffened. The judge's smirk wavered. The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable. Nia didn't move, didn't blink. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Bernaire exhaled sharply, rolling his eyes. "Why not?" "Let's see what nonsense you've come up with." The gallery whispered as Nia strode forward. She moved with purpose, confidence, a quiet storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick legal file, placing it firmly on the judge's desk. A moment of silence followed. Judge Brenner raised an eyebrow as he flipped open the first page. His smirk returned briefly. But then, as his eyes scanned the document, the smirk disappeared. The courtroom noticed. Caldwell's confidence wavered. The jury leaned in slightly. Even the gallery quieted, sensing the sudden shift in energy. The judge flipped another page, then another. His lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers gripped the edge of the paper, just a little tighter. He looked up. "Where did you get this?" Nia clasped her hands together in front of her. "I prepared it," the gallery murmured. Some leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of what was written. Even some of the white jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Caldwell stepped forward, reaching for the file. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The prosecution's case is built on faulty evidence," Nia interrupted. Her voice was calm but firm. "Here are the chain of custody issues with Exhibit A. Here's how the timeline of my so-called forged documents doesn't align. And here's where procedural violations occurred during my detainment." Judge Brenner's jaw tightened as he looked to Caldwell. "Is this accurate?" Caldwell grabbed the file, flipping through it rapidly. His ears turned red. His eyes darted back and forth across the pages. She was right. Every single page, flawless. The prosecutor stumbled, searching for a way to dismiss it. "Your Honor, she's twisting technicalities." "Am I?" Nia turned to the jury, her voice measured, steady. "Or is the prosecution assuming that, because I'm young and black, I wouldn't understand how the legal system works?" Silence. A few of the white jurors shifted uncomfortably. The judge exhaled sharply. He glanced between the file in his hands and the girl standing confidently before him. The weight of the moment was undeniable. "Let's take a recess," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. Murmurs filled the air as the judge banged his gavel, signaling the break. Reporters in the back of the room scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Black spectators nodded at each other, some with small, knowing smiles. The white jurors who had previously laughed now wore more neutral expressions. Caldwell slammed the file shut, glaring at Nia as she calmly returned to her seat. She met his gaze completely unbothered, because she wasn't done yet, not even close. Judge Brenner sat motionless, his gavel resting against the desk as his jaw tightened. His amusement had vanished, replaced with something colder. Frustration, disbelief. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes locked onto Nia, scanning her face as if trying to find the trick, the deception, the flaw in her confidence. "Where did you get this knowledge?" His voice was sharp now, laced with irritation. His fingers drummed against the bench, his previous smugness gone. Nia didn't blink, didn't hesitate. She simply straightened her posture and delivered the words that would shatter the courtroom. "Because, Your Honor, I am a licensed attorney." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The journalists in the back, who had been lazily scribbling down notes, suddenly perked up. Pens scratched furiously against notepads. A camera clicked. The murmurs of the spectators turned into a buzz of disbelief, spreading through the room like wildfire. Caldwell let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "What?" His voice rose slightly, cracking with forced amusement. "What kind of joke is this?" Judge Brenner's face drained of color. His fingers gripped the edges of his desk, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Thompson," he said slower this time, his voice measured, "I hope you understand the consequences of perjury." Nia tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of a smile touching her lips. "I do, and I have no reason to lie. If you don't believe me, Your Honor, you're welcome to check the records." The judge's expression hardened, but he turned to the court clerk regardless. "Verify it." A new silence stretched across the courtroom as the clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, began typing furiously. The rapid clacking of her keyboard echoed in the hushed room. All eyes were on her. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched at his sides as he glanced toward the jury. A few of them were staring at Nia with something new in their expressions. Not just curiosity, but doubt. Doubt in him. Doubt in the case. The seconds dragged. The clerk stopped typing. She adjusted her glasses, squinted at the screen, then looked up. Her voice was almost a whisper. "It's true." The courtroom erupted. A mix of gasps, stunned whispers, and outright exclamations filled the air. Some of the black spectators nodded in satisfaction, their arms crossing over their chests. A few white onlookers exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered frantically among themselves. Caldwell shot forward. "That's impossible." He snatched the file from the judge's desk, flipping through the pages as if expecting to find some mistake. This has to be wrong." "It isn't," Nia said smoothly, clasping her hands in front of her. Judge Brenner ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He looked like a man who had just been tricked, except he hadn't been. He had mocked her, dismissed her, humiliated her in his courtroom. And now he realized that he had just spent the last hour talking down to a legitimate lawyer, a child prodigy. He swallowed thickly. "Explain yourself." Nia nodded once. "I graduated high school early, completed my undergraduate degree in 2 years, and passed the California bar exam at 16. I'm registered with the State Bar Association. You're welcome to check." The courtroom buzzed louder. A journalist whispered to a colleague, "This is insane." His hands flew over his notepad, jotting down every word. Judge Brenner, his composure slipping, turned back to the clerk. "Check the bar records." The clerk typed again, her fingers moving swiftly. A few more agonizing moments passed. Then she nodded. "She's listed in the system as a licensed attorney." Another explosion of noise. A white man in the gallery whispered, "No way!" A black woman near the front smirked. A reporter's camera flashed, capturing the moment. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple. His hand gripped his gavel, but he didn't slam it down. He couldn't. Not yet. Caldwell's face twisted with disbelief. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. She's a child." "She's a lawyer," Brenner corrected him, his voice strained. Nia inhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. She had spent her life being underestimated, overlooked. She had seen the disbelief in people's eyes whenever she spoke with confidence, saw their skepticism when she displayed her knowledge. Now they had no choice but to see her for who she was, a professional, a legal expert, someone who knew the system better than most of the men in that room. Judge Brenner finally looked at her again, his voice quieter this time. "Why did you do this?" Nia held his gaze. "Because justice isn't given to people like me, Your Honor. We have to take it." The words settled heavily in the room. Caldwell clenched his jaw, his entire case unraveling before his eyes. He had walked into this courtroom assuming he had already won. But now, with the jury shifting in their seats, the reporters writing furiously, and the judge himself thrown off balance, he realized something terrifying. He had already lost. Judge Brenner's grip tightened on his gavel, his knuckles white as he scanned the courtroom. The murmurs from the gallery had grown louder. black spectators exchanging knowing glances, nodding in hushed agreement. They weren't just watching a trial anymore. This was something bigger, a reckoning, a mirror held up to a system that had failed them time and time again. The judge's face was flushed with frustration, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. He cleared his throat and banged the gavel once. Enough! This trial has gone far beyond its original purpose. His voice wavered, but he pushed forward. I am dismissing this case. Nia was already shaking her head before he finished. You can't! Bernare's jaw clenched. Excuse me? Nia stepped forward, hands steady on the table. You have no legal standing to dismiss this case, Your Honor. To do so would be a direct violation of judicial ethics. Bernare's lips parted slightly, his composure cracking. He cast a quick glance toward the prosecution table, as if searching for backup. Caldwell shot to his feet, his voice rising in frustration. Your Honor, this is absurd. She's turning this into a political spectacle. No, Nia said evenly, turning toward the jury, her eyes locking onto them. I'm turning this into the truth. The jury, once skeptical, once distant, was now watching her closely. Some of them exchanged glances. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and they knew it. Nia turned back to the judge, voice unwavering. This case was built on lies. She reached for the folder in front of her, flipping it open with precision. Let's start with the businessman who pressed charges against me. She pulled out a set of eviction records. These are the original files. And these, she pulled out another set, identical except for the dates and signatures, are the altered versions he submitted to the court. She held them up, letting the jury see. Bernare's brow furrowed. He glanced toward Caldwell. Is this accurate? Caldwell swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the desk. Your Honor, this is... Yes or no, Mr. Caldwell? Silence. Nia didn't wait. She flipped to the next document. Now let's talk about the prosecution's role in this. Mr. Caldwell, you claimed there was overwhelming evidence against me. You claimed I forged documents. But what you didn't say, what you didn't want the jury to know, is that there were witness statements that contradicted your claims? She held up another set of papers. Here are the original statements from the evicted tenants, the ones who testified about the landlord's actions, the ones you conveniently never submitted into evidence. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Bernare's face paled. Caldwell stiffened. The black spectators in the gallery started murmuring, nodding in realization. This wasn't just about Nia. This was about all the cases just like hers. Bernare's fingers twitched on his gavel. That's enough, Miss Thompson. No, Nia cut in, her voice sharper now. We're not done. The murmurs grew louder. Nia turned to the jury. And finally, let's talk about this courtroom. Let's talk about the bias in this very seat of justice. She slid another document forward. This is a list of the last 50 cases Judge Bernare has presided over involving black defendants. Bernare's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid. Nia continued. In those cases, he dismissed exactly 0. Not 1. 0. But in cases where white defendants were involved? She let the words hang in the air. He dismissed over 30%. The courtroom erupted. Some people gasped audibly. Others murmured furiously, the tension now boiling over. The journalists were writing furiously, cameras clicking nonstop. Bernare slammed his gavel down. Order! But for the first time, nobody stopped. The black audience members nodded to each other, whispering their own stories of injustice. The jury members looked at one another, their expressions shifting. Nia turned back to Bernare, her voice steady. You wanted to dismiss this case because you never thought someone like me would challenge you. Her eyes pierced into him. But justice doesn't bow to personal bias. Bernare exhaled sharply, sweat beating at his temple. Nia held the jury's gaze. If this trial is really about the law, if it's really about justice, then you'll judge me based on the facts. Silence stretched across the room. For the first time, the judge looked uncertain. For the first time, the jury wasn't on his side. For the first time, the truth had taken center stage. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye fixed on Judge Bernare as he sat frozen, his fingers clutching the gavel with white-knuckled intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, he was at a loss. The businessman who had filed the case against Nia stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face was twisted with frustration, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line. He muttered something under his breath before turning on his heel and storming out of the courtroom. A few reporters scrambled after him, their notepads flipping open, cameras flashing, but he shoved past them without a word. He knew it was over. At the prosecution's table, Ethan Caldwell shifted uneasily, his once polished confidence now crumbling into panic. He reached for his notes, flipping through them frantically as if searching for something, anything to salvage his case. "Your Honor," Caldwell finally managed, his voice strained, "the prosecution, requests additional time to review these new documents and, assess the validity of—" Judge Brenner slammed the gavel down hard. The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed through the chamber, demanding silence. The murmurs ceased. Caldwell stiffened. Brenner exhaled through his nose, his face still slightly pale, as he turned to Nia. She sat poised, waiting, her expression unreadable. Unlike Caldwell, unlike the businessman who had fled, she wasn't scrambling. She wasn't panicking. She knew she had already won. The judge cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. His fingers tapped against the desk once, twice before he finally spoke. "Miss Thompson." His voice was quieter now, missing the arrogance it once held. "You have presented evidence that the prosecution has failed to disprove." Caldwell inhaled sharply, his lips parted, ready to protest. Brenner lifted a hand to silence him. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the court finds that the primary evidence used against you is unreliable. Chain of custody issues, suppressed witness statements, altered documents." He exhaled heavily. "This trial should never have gone this far." Caldwell's face turned red. The jury members nodded to one another. The gallery, particularly the black spectators, sat forward in their seats, waiting for what they never thought they'd hear. Judge Brenner picked up his gavel again. "The case against Miss Thompson is hereby dismissed." For a fraction of a second, there was total silence. Then, applause. It started as a single clap, then another, until the courtroom erupted. Something like this had never happened in Brenner's courtroom before. Black families standing, cheering, clapping, nodding in victory. Even some of the jurors smiled slightly. Caldwell's jaw clenched as he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, his face burning with humiliation. Judge Brenner sat motionless for a moment, watching it all unfold, his face unreadable. He had been on the bench for decades, unchallenged, unshaken. Now, for the first time in his career, he looked powerless. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the courthouse steps as Nia Thompson pushed through the heavy double doors. A wave of reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her face. The sound of their voices blended into a single roar of questions, frantic and urgent. "Miss Thompson, how does it feel to win against the system? Did you ever doubt yourself? What's next for you?" A journalist near the front, her voice cutting through the chaos, asked the question that made the crowd go silent. "How did you do it?" Nia didn't hesitate. She looked directly into the camera, her expression steady, her voice unwavering. "Because justice isn't given, it's taken." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a flurry of notes scribbled, cameras clicking as her response echoed across headlines. She didn't wait for another question. She turned and walked down the steps, moving past the flashing lights and microphones. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The case had shaken the system. The evicted tenants, once tossed aside like they didn't matter, won back their homes. The landlord who had destroyed their lives, his assets were frozen, his legal team scrambling for damage control. Judge Brenner, the man who once ruled his courtroom like a king, now found himself under scrutiny. His history of dismissing black cases, his blatant bias, was now front-page news. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee had launched a formal investigation. But it wasn't just about the tenants or the judge. It was about every black defendant who had ever walked into a courtroom like hers, already condemned before they spoke. Nia had been dismissed, mocked, laughed at, but she had won, and the world had seen it. She was no longer just a teenager who had challenged the system. She was now a symbol, a national icon for Black resilience, for justice, for change. As she walked down the courthouse steps, her phone vibrated. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "We need more people like you in the system. Call me when you're ready." She stared at the text for a long moment before slipping the phone back into her pocket. She had stepped into that courtroom to prove a point. She left knowing she had started something bigger.